Before the United States became the industrial engine that powered Allied victory in World War II, it was a nation still struggling to stand on its feet. In the late 1930s, America was not preparing for war, it was trying to survive peace. The Great Depression had devastated the economy. Nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans was unemployed at its worst. Factories that once symbolized prosperity stood silent, their smokestacks cold, their machines rusting from disuse. Entire industrial cities slowed to a crawl. Steel mills reduced output. Automobile plants closed their doors. For millions of families, daily life revolved around survival, not global ambition. Across the Atlantic, however, the world was moving rapidly toward conflict. Germany was rearming at full speed under Adolf Hitler, rebuilding its military and expanding its industrial base specifically for war. Japan was doing the same in Asia, driven by imperial ambition and the need for resources. Britain and France, still haunted by the memory of World War I, watched nervously as another global conflict approached. In contrast, the United States seemed distant both geographically and politically. Protected by vast oceans, Americans believed they could remain untouched by the violence consuming Europe and Asia. Isolationism dominated American politics during this period. Many citizens felt the country had been dragged unnecessarily into World War I and paid a terrible price for it. More than 100,000 American soldiers had died, and many believed the war had achieved little. As a result, Congress passed laws limiting foreign involvement and arms sales. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming resistance to entering another European war. Even as Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and war officially began, the United States declared neutrality. To the outside world, America looked reluctant, divided, and slow. Foreign leaders took notice, and they drew the wrong conclusions. In Berlin, Nazi planners viewed the United States as an economic power but not a military threat. They believed America lacked the political unity and discipline needed for total war. In Tokyo, Japanese strategists saw the U.S. as wealthy but soft, dependent on consumer comfort and unprepared for sacrifice. Both underestimated the very thing that would later destroy them, America's capacity to transform. What these nations failed to understand was that America's apparent weakness was not structural, it was temporary. Beneath the economic hardship lay the most advanced industrial system on Earth. The United States possessed enormous reserves of iron, coal, aluminum, copper, and oil. Its farmland could feed not only its own population but entire armies overseas. It had the world's largest internal market, a culture built around mass production, and a transportation network unmatched in scale. Railroads connected coast to coast. Rivers carried raw materials deep into the interior. Ports on both oceans linked America to the world. Most importantly, American factories were not destroyed by war. Unlike Europe and Asia, the United States had suffered no bombing, no invasion, no industrial collapse. Its factories were idle, not ruined. Their machines were still there, their workers were still alive. The system was intact, waiting for a spark. That spark came not from Europe, but from the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In a matter of hours, battleships burned, sailors died, and America's sense of security vanished. The attack did more than bring the United States into the war, it unified the nation overnight. Isolationism collapsed, political divisions faded. The question was no longer whether America would fight, but how completely it would commit. The answer was total mobilization. Almost immediately, the American government began reorganizing the entire economy for war. Civilian priorities were replaced with military necessity. New agencies were created to oversee production, allocate resources, and eliminate waste. The War Production Board was established to direct industrial output. Companies were told what to make, how much to make, and how fast to make it. This level of coordination was unprecedented in American history. What followed was not gradual, it was explosive. Factories that once produced cars, appliances, and consumer goods were ordered to convert to military production. Automobile plants became tank factories. Refrigerator manufacturers produced aircraft parts. Even toy companies contributed by producing precision components. This was not chaos, it was organized transformation. Engineers redesigned assembly lines for speed, standardized parts replaced custom designs. The goal was no longer profit or aesthetics. The goal was volume. At first, many doubted whether such a massive transformation could succeed. Could a civilian economy truly become a war machine? Could workers with no military background produce weapons fast enough to matter? These doubts did not last long. By 1942, American factories were producing weapons at a pace that shocked both allies and enemies. What made this possible was not just technology, it was mindset. The attack on Pearl Harbor convinced Americans that survival was at stake. Workers no longer saw factory jobs as employment. They saw them as service. Every tank built, every rifle assembled, every ship launched was seen as a direct contribution to victory. The factory floor became a battlefield of its own. This was the moment the war truly changed. While soldiers trained and deployed overseas, the foundation of victory was being laid at home. America had awakened an industrial giant, and once awake, it would prove impossible to stop. Once the United States committed fully to the war, speed became everything. Winning was no longer about preparation alone. It was about outproducing the enemy before they could adapt. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood this better than anyone. In December 1940, even before America officially entered the war, he delivered a radio address that would redefine modern warfare. He declared that the United States must become the arsenal of democracy. This was not an inspirational phrase, it was a blueprint. Roosevelt believed that if America could supply itself and its allies with overwhelming material strength, the outcome of the war would be decided long before the final battles were fought. Turning that vision into reality required unprecedented coordination between government, industry, and labor. The federal government did not nationalize factories, but it exercised immense control over what they produced and how resources were distributed. Steel, aluminum, rubber, oil, and copper were strictly rationed. Companies were told exactly how much material they would receive and what they were expected to deliver in return. Civilian production was cut to the bone. By 1942, the manufacture of new automobiles for civilians was completely halted. The American consumer economy was put on hold so that the war economy could dominate. Industrial leaders were brought directly into the war effort. Executives from major corporations worked alongside military planners to solve production challenges. Engineers redesigned equipment to be easier and faster to build. Complex weapon systems were simplified so that untrained workers could assemble them quickly. Standardization became a weapon in itself. Parts were made interchangeable, allowing repairs to be done rapidly in the field and assembly lines to operate with maximum efficiency. This approach sacrificed elegance for speed, and it worked. The automobile industry became the backbone of American war production. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler possessed unmatched experience in mass production, and their assembly line techniques were adapted for military use. Ford's massive Willow Run plant became a symbol of industrial power, producing B-2 Liberator bombers at a pace once thought impossible. What had previously taken weeks to build was now completed in hours. Bombers rolled off the line in a continuous stream, each one identical, each one ready for war. Shipbuilding followed a similar transformation. Before the war, constructing a cargo ship could take more than a year. American shipyards shattered that timeline. Liberty ships were designed to be simple, standardized, and fast to assemble. Welding replaced traditional riveting, saving time and labor. Prefabricated sections were built inland and transported to shipyards for final assembly. At peak production, a Liberty ship was launched every few hours. Some were completed in less than 5 days. The oceans soon filled with American-built vessels carrying troops, tanks, fuel, and food across the world. Aircraft production reached levels no one believed possible. In 1939, the United States produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number exceeded 96,000 in a single year. Factories across the country, many of which had never produced aircraft before, were now building fighters, bombers, and transport planes. Entire cities became aviation hubs. The sound of engines replaced silence. The sky above America became a training ground for thousands of new pilots. This massive expansion was fueled by a workforce that grew larger and more diverse than ever before. Millions of men left factories to join the military, creating labor shortages that were filled by women. For the first time, women entered heavy industry on a massive scale. They operated drills, welded steel, and assembled engines. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of national determination. This was not propaganda alone, it reflected reality. By 1944, women made up nearly one-third of the industrial workforce. African Americans also played a crucial role in the arsenal of democracy. Facing discrimination and limited opportunities in the South, many moved north and west to work in war factories. Although segregation and inequality persisted, the demand for labor forced industries to open doors that had long been closed. This migration reshaped American cities and laid the groundwork for future social change. The war effort did not erase injustice, but it did expose its contradictions. Production was relentless. Factories ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers rotated through exhausting shifts, accidents were common. Fatigue was constant, yet morale remained high. Workers understood that their labor was directly connected to the lives of soldiers overseas. Newsreels, posters, and radio broadcasts reinforced this connection, reminding Americans that every missed shift and every wasted part could cost lives at the front. The arsenal of democracy did more than supply American forces, it armed the world. Through programs like Lend-Lease, the United States sent massive quantities of weapons, vehicles, food, and fuel to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies. American-built tanks fought on the Eastern Front. American trucks kept Soviet armies moving. American aircraft filled British airfields. Even before American troops arrived in large numbers, American factories were already shaping the battlefield. By 1943, it was clear that something unprecedented was happening. The United States was not just participating in the war, it was redefining how wars were fought. Industrial output had become a strategic weapon, as decisive as any army or navy. The question was no longer whether America could produce enough. The question was whether its enemies could survive the flood of material pouring out of American factories. They could not. By the middle of World War II, it became impossible to ignore the sheer scale of American industrial output. The war was no longer decided only by tactics or bravery, but by arithmetic. Every battle became a calculation. How many tanks could be built? How many planes could be replaced? How long supplies could last? And in this brutal math of war, the United States held an overwhelming advantage. Numbers that once seemed unbelievable became routine, and what America produced in months exceeded what other nations could build in years. Aircraft production alone revealed the imbalance. Germany entered the war with one of the most advanced air forces in the world. Japan's pilots were among the best trained and most experienced. Britain fought desperately to maintain control of the skies. Yet none of these nations could match American output. From fewer than 3,000 military aircraft in 1939, the United States ramped up to producing nearly 100,000 planes per year by 1944. Factories that had never built aircraft before were now turning out fighters and bombers at industrial speed. Each loss in combat was replaced almost immediately. For Axis pilots, every victory became meaningless, because the enemy's air power never seemed to diminish. Tank production told the same story. German tanks were feared for their engineering and firepower, but they were complex and slow to build. American tanks, by contrast, were designed for mass production. They were simpler, easier to repair, and built in staggering numbers. While Germany struggled to replace losses, the United States produced tens of thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. American forces did not need perfect machines, they needed enough machines. Quantity became its own form of quality. Naval production reached levels never before seen. The United States Navy expanded from a regional force into the largest fleet in history. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and cargo ships poured out of American shipyards. Liberty ships and Victory ships became the logistical backbone of the Allied war effort. These vessels transported troops, vehicles, fuel, and food across hostile oceans filled with enemy submarines. When ships were sunk, replacements arrived faster than the enemy could destroy them. German U-boat commanders reported a terrifying reality. No matter how many ships they sank, more kept coming. Small arms and ammunition production was equally overwhelming. American factories produced millions of rifles, machine guns, pistols, and artillery pieces. Billions of rounds of ammunition were manufactured and shipped overseas. American soldiers rarely worried about running out of bullets. Axis soldiers often did. This difference alone determined the outcome of countless battles. Firepower, sustained over time, broke resistance and crushed morale. Even vehicles that never appeared in propaganda proved decisive. Trucks, jeeps, and transport vehicles were produced in enormous quantities. These machines allowed Allied armies to move faster, supply farther, and fight longer. In contrast, German and Japanese forces relied heavily on horses and limited motorization. The modern battlefield rewarded mobility, and American factories delivered it in abundance. Perhaps the most astonishing aspect of this production was its consistency. While Axis industry faced shortages, bombings, and internal disruption, American factories operated at full capacity year after year. There were no air raids on Detroit, Pittsburgh, or Chicago. No factory districts were reduced to rubble. No transportation networks were crippled by bombing. Workers arrived for their shifts, machines kept running, and output kept climbing. The war never reached American soil, and that allowed production to continue uninterrupted. This industrial security was not accidental. Geography played a crucial role. Two vast oceans separated the United States from its enemies, making large-scale attacks on the homeland nearly impossible. Axis bombers lacked the range and logistical support to strike deep into American territory. Submarines could disrupt shipping but could not stop production. Unlike Britain, Germany, or Japan, the United States fought the war from a position of industrial safety. As American output surged, Axis production collapsed. German factories faced constant bombing, labor shortages, and raw material constraints. Japan struggled with limited resources and devastating air raids. Skilled workers were killed or conscripted. Transportation networks were destroyed. Every loss became permanent. The longer the war lasted, the worse the imbalance grew. This reality crushed morale among Axis leaders and soldiers alike. German commanders reported that American units seemed endlessly supplied. Japanese pilots faced waves of new aircraft that never stopped coming. The psychological impact was enormous. Fighting an enemy who could not be exhausted drained hope and confidence. Victory requires belief, and American production destroyed that belief. By 1944, the outcome of the war was already determined by numbers alone. Battles still had to be fought. Lives still had to be lost. But the industrial contest, the true war behind the war, had been decided. The United States had achieved what no nation in history had done before. It turned mass production into a decisive military weapon. The Axis powers did not lose because their soldiers lacked courage. They lost because they could not compete with a nation that built faster, replaced losses instantly, and never ran out of tools to fight. In World War II, the United States proved a brutal truth. When industrial capacity becomes unlimited, defeat becomes inevitable for anyone who cannot match it. Behind every tank, every aircraft, and every ship that left an American factory during World War II stood a worker whose life had been completely transformed by war. These men and women did not carry rifles or march into combat, but their labor decided whether battles could be fought at all. They were welders, machinists, riveters, engineers, clerks, and janitors. Together, they formed an invisible army, one that never appeared on the battlefield, yet determined its outcome. When the war began, millions of American men left their jobs to join the armed forces. This sudden loss of labor created an urgent crisis in factories just as production demands exploded. The solution reshaped American society. Women entered industrial work on a scale never seen before. They did not simply replace men in light manufacturing, they took on heavy industrial roles once considered impossible for them. They welded steel hulls, assembled aircraft engines, operated heavy machinery, and worked long shifts under intense pressure. The image of Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of this transformation. She was strong, confident, and determined. representing millions of women who stepped into factories not for recognition, but out of necessity. For many, this was their first experience earning steady wages, handling complex machinery, and contributing directly to national survival. Work was exhausting and often dangerous. Accidents were frequent, protective equipment was limited, yet absenteeism remained low. Women understood that every hour mattered. African Americans also became a critical part of the wartime workforce. Facing deep discrimination and limited opportunities in the South, many moved north and west to take factory jobs. This migration, one of the largest internal movements in American history, transformed cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles. While segregation and inequality persisted, the sheer demand for labor forced industries to hire workers they had previously excluded. War production did not end racism, but it exposed its inefficiency. A nation fighting for survival could not afford to waste human potential. Immigrants and rural Americans joined the industrial surge as well. Farmers left fields to work in plants. Teenagers took after-school shifts. Older workers returned from retirement. Training programs sprang up across the country to teach new skills quickly. Many workers learned complex tasks in days rather than years. Speed mattered more than tradition. What counted was output. Factory life during the war was relentless. Shifts ran 24 hours a day. Plants never slept. Workers rotated through nights, weekends, and holidays. Noise was constant. Machines thundered. The smell of oil, smoke, and metal filled the air. Fatigue was unavoidable, yet productivity continued to rise. Workers pushed themselves because they believed their labor had purpose. Government propaganda reinforced this belief. Posters reminded workers that loose lips sink ships and the man who I send tea, there may be your brother. Newsreels showed American weapons in action, linking factory labor directly to battlefield success. War bond drives turned wages into financial support for the military. Workers did not see themselves as civilians, they saw themselves as participants in a national struggle. Unions played a crucial role in maintaining stability. Despite tensions, major labor organizations agreed not to strike during the war. Disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than disruption. This cooperation prevented production slowdowns and kept factories running at full speed. It was an uneasy truce, but a necessary one. Everyone understood that internal conflict could cost lives overseas. Psychological pressure was immense. Workers knew that mistakes could be fatal. A poorly welded joint, a faulty engine part, or a missed inspection could lead to deaths on the battlefield. Quality control became a matter of life and death. Pride in workmanship remained strong, even as speed dominated production. The idea that someone's son is using this became a powerful motivator. Despite the hardships, the war years created a sense of shared purpose rarely seen before or since. People from different backgrounds worked side by side. Communities formed around factories. Canteens, daycare centers, and housing projects were built to support workers. The factory became the center of social life. War production reshaped daily routines, family structures, and personal identities. When soldiers wrote letters home, they often thanked factory workers. When workers listened to radio broadcasts from the front, they recognized the machines they had built. This connection bridged the gap between home front and battlefield. It reminded Americans that victory depended on cooperation between those who fought and those who produced. By the end of the war, millions of workers had gained skills, confidence, and experience that would shape post-war America. Women had proven they could perform industrial labor at the highest level. African Americans had demonstrated their essential role in national defense. The workforce that powered the arsenal of democracy had permanently changed the country it served. The invisible army of workers never received medals or parades. Yet, without them, no invasion would have succeeded, no supply line would have held, and no victory would have been possible. They were not behind the war effort, they were the war effort. By 1942, the leaders of Germany and Japan understood a terrifying reality. They were not fighting just enemy soldiers. They were fighting an enemy that could replace everything they destroyed. Every tank knocked out, every aircraft shot down, every ship sunk was quickly replaced by another bearing American markings. This was not normal warfare. Traditionally, attrition weakened nations over time, but against the United States, attrition worked in reverse. The longer the war continued, the stronger America became. Axis strategists began to identify the true source of Allied strength. It was not Washington, it was not the generals, it was not even the soldiers. It was the factories. The machines, the assembly lines, the workers operating day and night. This was the heart of American power. As long as that heart kept beating, defeat was inevitable. The only solution was to stop it. In Germany, military planners had long believed that industrial warfare was decisive. The Luftwaffe had been designed to cripple enemy production by bombing factories, rail yards, and ports. In Europe, this strategy often worked. Cities like London, Rotterdam, and Stalingrad suffered devastating damage. Germany assumed that similar tactics could be applied to the United States, but geography changed everything. The United States was simply too far away. German bombers lacked the range to cross the Atlantic, deliver payloads, and return safely. Even if they could reach American shores, they would face overwhelming defenses and vast distances between industrial centers. Unlike Europe, where factories were clustered in dense urban regions, American industry was spread across an entire continent. Destroying a single factory would have little effect. Thousands more would continue producing. Japan faced similar limitations. While Japanese submarines did operate off the American coast and even shelled isolated locations, these actions had no meaningful impact on production. Japan lacked long-range bombers capable of reaching deep into the United States. Its industrial capacity was already stretched thin fighting across the Pacific. Any attempt to strike American factories directly would have required resources Japan did not possess. Despite these limitations, Axis leaders explored every possible way to slow American production. Submarine warfare became one such method. German U-boats attempted to choke off supply lines by sinking cargo ships in the Atlantic. For a time, this campaign was effective. Ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced. But American factories responded with increased shipbuilding. Liberty ships flooded the oceans. New anti-submarine technologies were developed. Within a year, the tide had turned. Submarine losses mounted and supply lines remained intact. Sabotage and espionage were also considered. German agents were sent to disrupt factories and infrastructure. However, these efforts were limited and largely ineffective. The scale of American industry made isolated acts of sabotage meaningless. Shutting down one plant barely registered in the overall output. The system was too large, too redundant, too resilient. The fear driving these efforts was not hypothetical, it was mathematical. Axis leaders saw production reports. They knew how many tanks, aircraft, and ships the United States was building. They compared these numbers to their own output and understood the gap was widening rapidly. This realization changed how they viewed the war. Victory through battlefield success alone was no longer possible. The only hope lay in shortening the war before American production reached its full potential. This urgency influenced Axis strategy in critical ways. Japan's decision to strike Pearl Harbor was partly driven by the belief that a decisive blow could cripple American naval power long enough to secure dominance in the Pacific. But the attack failed to destroy American aircraft carriers and did nothing to harm industrial capacity. Instead, it awakened the very force Japan feared most. Germany made similar miscalculations. Adolf Hitler delayed full economic mobilization, believing the war would be short. By the time Germany attempted to increase production, Allied bombing and resource shortages made it impossible to match American output. The window to compete had closed. As the war progressed, Axis morale suffered. Soldiers reported facing endless waves of equipment. Pilots encountered American aircraft faster than they could be shot down. Tank crews faced replacements that seemed to appear overnight. The psychological effect was devastating. Fighting an enemy who cannot be exhausted destroys confidence. Every victory feels temporary, every loss feels permanent. The inability to strike American factories became a strategic nightmare. While Allied bombers reduced German and Japanese cities to rubble, American industrial centers remained untouched. This asymmetry defined the war. One side fought under constant attack, the other fought from a position of security. Over time, the outcome became inevitable. American factories did not merely support Allied strategy, they dictated it. Commanders could plan operations knowing that supplies would be available. Losses could be accepted because replacements were guaranteed. This confidence shaped decisions at every level of the war. By 1944, Axis leaders knew the truth, even if they could not admit it publicly. The war was lost not because of a single defeat, but because of an unstoppable industrial force they could neither match nor destroy. The factories they feared most remained beyond reach, producing victory one machine at a time. For all their fear of American industrial power, the Axis nations faced an unchangeable reality. The United States was almost impossible to strike at its core. While factories across Europe and Asia burned under relentless bombing, American production centers remained largely untouched. This was not a coincidence. It was the result of geography, planning, scale, and defense working together in a way no enemy could overcome. The most obvious factor was distance. The United States was protected by two vast oceans, each thousands of miles wide. Any bomber force attempting to reach American factories would have needed enormous range, secure bases, aerial refueling, and fighter protection capabilities the Axis powers simply did not possess. German bombers were designed for European distances, not transoceanic warfare. Japanese bombers faced similar limitations. Even if aircraft could reach American shores, returning safely was another matter entirely. A one-way attack would achieve little against a system that could absorb damage and continue producing. Naval attacks offered no better solution. Submarines could harass shipping lanes, but they could not destroy factories inland. American industry was not concentrated along the coast. Steel mills in Pennsylvania, automobile plants in Michigan, aircraft factories in California, and shipyards across multiple states formed a dispersed network. Destroying one facility would not stop production elsewhere. The system was redundant by design, even before war forced greater decentralization. This dispersion became one of America's greatest strengths. Unlike Germany, where key industrial regions were clustered and vulnerable, American factories were spread across thousands of miles. Railroads and highways linked them together, allowing materials and finished goods to move efficiently. If one route was disrupted, another could be used. If one plant slowed, others increased output. There was no single point of failure. Homeland defense further strengthened this position. While the United States never experienced large-scale bombing, it prepared for the possibility. Coastal defenses were reinforced. Air patrols monitored the skies. Radar systems expanded. Civil defense plans were developed. Though these measures were rarely tested, their existence added another layer of deterrence. Any attempt to attack American industry would face heavy resistance and minimal strategic gain. Perhaps most importantly, American industry benefited from uninterrupted operation. There were no air raids forcing factories to shut down, no workers fleeing bombed cities, no transportation networks reduced to rubble. Production schedules could be planned months in advance without fear of disruption. This stability allowed efficiency to increase steadily. Output did not fluctuate, it climbed. Contrast this with Axis industry. German factories were constantly relocating, dispersing, and hiding from Allied bombers. Production lines were broken apart. Underground facilities were constructed at enormous cost. Transportation networks were repeatedly destroyed. Workers were killed or displaced. Efficiency suffered. Japan faced similar challenges, compounded by shortages of fuel and raw materials. Every adjustment meant delays. Every delay meant fewer weapons. American industry faced none of these constraints. Raw materials flowed freely. Oil, steel, aluminum, and rubber were available in abundance. Supply chains were secure. Factories did not compete for scarce resources. They were supplied according to coordinated national plans. This allowed production to operate at full capacity without interruption. Another crucial factor was time. The United States entered the war later than many other nations, but this proved to be an advantage. While Axis economies were already strained by years of conflict, America began its full mobilization with a fresh industrial base. Its machines were modern, its workforce was rested. Its infrastructure was intact. It could expand without the burden of constant repair. The psychological effect of this security was immense. American workers did not fear bombing raids. They did not worry about losing their homes or families to air attacks. This allowed them to focus entirely on production. Morale remained high, fatigue was real, but fear was minimal. In contrast, Axis workers labored under constant threat. This difference mattered. Productivity is not just mechanical, it is human. Allied commanders understood this advantage and built strategy around it. Operations were planned with the assumption that supplies would be available. Losses were calculated with replacement in mind. Logistics became a science, not a gamble. American industry allowed Allied forces to fight wars of movement, sustain long campaigns, and recover quickly from setbacks. By 1944, the gap was insurmountable. Even if the Axis had somehow managed to strike a handful of American factories, the impact would have been negligible. The system was too large, too dispersed, too resilient. It had been designed for mass production and proven by war. The untouchable nature of American industry did not make victory easy, but it made defeat nearly impossible. While battles were still fought and lives still lost, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The factories kept running, the machines kept coming, and with every day that passed, the distance between America and its enemies grew wider. While American factories operated in safety and expanded without interruption, the industrial systems of Germany and Japan moved in the opposite direction toward collapse. This contrast was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, year by year, as the demands of total war exposed the weaknesses of Axis economies. By the time Allied forces began their final offensives, the industrial defeat of the Axis powers was already complete, even if the fighting had not yet ended. Germany entered the war with a strong industrial base, but it was never designed for a long global conflict. Adolf Hitler believed wars should be short and decisive. Blitzkrieg was built on speed, not endurance. As a result, Germany did not fully mobilize its economy in the early years of the war. Civilian production continued longer than it should have. Industrial planning remained fragmented. Rivalries between government agencies, military branches, and Nazi officials created inefficiency. While American industry was unified under centralized coordination, German production was divided by competition and political infighting. As the war expanded, these weaknesses became fatal. Germany lacked sufficient access to critical raw materials. Oil shortages plagued the military. Synthetic fuel plants attempted to compensate, but they were expensive, inefficient, and vulnerable to attack. Steel, rubber, and aluminum supplies became increasingly scarce. Every shortage forced compromises in design, quality, or quantity. Production slowed even as demand increased. Allied bombing made matters worse. Beginning in earnest in 1943, strategic bombing campaigns targeted Germany's industrial heart. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and power plants were attacked relentlessly. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Workers were killed or displaced. Transportation networks collapsed. Even when factories survived, they struggled to receive raw materials or ship finished goods. Production became chaotic. Germany attempted to respond by dispersing factories and moving production underground. These efforts consumed enormous resources and time. Underground facilities were cramped, poorly ventilated, and inefficient. Skilled labor was in short supply. Forced labor was used extensively, but it was unmotivated, poorly trained, and often sabotaged production. Quality suffered. Output declined. What Germany gained in protection, it lost in efficiency. Japan faced an even more severe situation. Unlike Germany, Japan lacked abundant natural resources. It depended heavily on imported oil, iron, and food. When war cut off these supplies, Japan's industrial system began to choke. American submarines targeted shipping lanes, sinking tankers and cargo vessels faster than Japan could replace them. Fuel shortages crippled factories and grounded aircraft. Naval and air forces were forced to ration operations. As American bombing intensified, Japanese cities suffered devastating attacks. Industrial districts burned. Workers were killed or made homeless. Production fell sharply. Japan attempted to disperse factories into rural areas but lacked the infrastructure to support them. Transportation networks were inadequate. Power supplies were unreliable. The system unraveled. Unlike the United States, Axis economies were fighting wars while being destroyed from within. Factories operated under constant threat. Workers labored in fear. Repairs competed with production. Every day spent rebuilding was a day lost to output. Meanwhile, American factories grew stronger. The human cost was enormous. Skilled workers were drafted into the military or killed in bombings. Replacements lacked training, experience was lost. Machines wore out faster than they could be repaired. In contrast, American industry retained its workforce, improved training, and modernized equipment throughout the war. This collapse had direct battlefield consequences. German units faced shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Tanks were abandoned for lack of gasoline. Aircraft sat idle without fuel or pilots. Japanese forces were unable to replace lost ships and planes. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be trained. By 1944, Japanese air units were filled with novices flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming American strength. Morale suffered as reality set in. Axis soldiers realized they were fighting a losing war. Equipment grew scarcer. Supplies dwindled. Orders became desperate. The belief in victory faded. Industrial failure translated into psychological defeat. By the final year of the war, Axis production had fallen so far behind that recovery was impossible. Even brilliant tactics could not compensate for empty fuel tanks, missing parts, and untrained crews. The industrial war had been lost, and with it, the military war. The collapse of Axis industry was not merely a consequence of defeat, it was the cause of it. Once factories stopped producing, armies stopped functioning. Once armies stopped functioning, surrender became inevitable. By the time Allied armies advanced toward Berlin and Tokyo, the outcome of World War II was no longer decided by courage alone. It was decided by logistics, production, and endurance. On every front, American factories had tipped the balance so heavily that defeat for the Axis powers became only a matter of time. Soldiers still fought, and lives were still lost, but the industrial war, the real war, had already been won. Nowhere was this more visible than during the Allied invasion of Western Europe. The D-Day landings in June 1944 were not just a military operation, they were an industrial achievement. Every soldier who landed on the beaches was supported by a vast network of American production. Tanks, trucks, landing craft, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies all flowed from factories thousands of miles away. The invasion succeeded not simply because of bravery, but because American industry made failure unlikely. Losses could be replaced, equipment could be repaired, momentum could be maintained. As Allied forces pushed inland, the pattern repeated itself. German counterattacks failed not because German soldiers lacked skill, but because they lacked fuel, ammunition, and replacements. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, exposed this reality. German forces initially advanced but quickly ran out of supplies. American units, battered but well supplied, held their ground. Within weeks, the offensive collapsed. Industry, not tactics, decided the outcome. In the Pacific, American production proved equally decisive. The island-hopping campaign depended on constant naval and air superiority. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and transport ships were produced in quantities Japan could not match. When ships were damaged, they were repaired or replaced. When planes were lost, new squadrons arrived. Japanese forces, isolated and undersupplied, fought bravely but hopelessly. Industrial imbalance turned the Pacific War into a slow, relentless advance. By 1945, Axis resistance was collapsing everywhere. Germany surrendered in May. Japan followed in August after devastating bombing campaigns and the use of atomic weapons, another product of American industrial and scientific capacity. The war ended not with a final decisive battle, but with the exhaustion of nations that could no longer continue. When the fighting stopped, American factories did not. They transformed again, this time from instruments of war into engines of peace. Assembly lines that once produced tanks began producing cars. Aircraft plants shifted to civilian aviation. Shipyards turned to commercial shipping. The same industrial system that had armed the world now rebuilt it. The economic consequences were enormous. The United States emerged from the war with its infrastructure intact, its workforce skilled, and its economy booming. While Europe and Asia struggled to recover from destruction, America supplied them with goods, machinery, and financial support. Programs like the Marshall Plan extended American industrial influence across the globe. The war had not just been won, it had restructured the global order. World War II marked the moment the United States became a superpower. Not because of conquest, but because of production. American factories had demonstrated that modern power was measured not by territory alone, but by the ability to build, supply, and sustain. Military strength, economic dominance, and political influence all flowed from industrial capacity. The war also left lasting lessons. It proved that modern conflicts are total wars involving entire societies. Civilians are not spectators. Workers are not neutral. Every factory, every supply chain, every shipment matters. The line between battlefield and home front vanished forever. Perhaps the most important lesson was this: wars are often decided long before the first shot is fired. They are decided in preparation, infrastructure, and production. Once the industrial balance tips far enough, battlefield outcomes become predictable. American factories did not merely support the war effort. They defined it. They turned raw materials into power, labor into victory, and time into an unstoppable advantage. While soldiers carried the fight forward, factories ensured they would never fight alone or unarmed. World War II is remembered for its battles, its heroes, and its tragedies. But beneath every headline moment lies a quieter truth. The war was won not only by those who fought, but by those who built. In the end, it was not just armies that defeated the Axis powers. It was assembly lines, workers, machines, and an industrial system that no enemy could break. That is how American factories won World War II.